First of all, I'd like to say hello to you all. Very pleased to see that so many people have come out for this presentation today, and to welcome you to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Maureen Carroll, and I will be chairing the event today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here in person, and how nice that we can have in-person events again. My name is Maureen Carroll, as I said, and I'm Professor of Roman Archaeology and Chair of Roman Archaeology at the University of York. Three of my colleagues are here today, without whom this project would not have been possible. Lucy Creighton, in the middle here, is the Curator of Archaeology at the Yorkshire Museum, working for the York Museums Trust. She's part of the team responsible for looking after and sharing the Yorkshire Museum's designated archaeology collection, which includes some of the finest Roman material from Britain. Patrick Gibbs, sitting next to her, heads up the technology team at Heritage 360, a research and services centre for digital technology and in the heritage sector at the University of York. And last but not least, sitting on the right is James Osborn, who also works for Heritage 360 and is a digital technology specialist. And their crucial role in this project, which is coming to an end at the end of June with University of York funding, for which we're very grateful, their role in this project will be very apparent. So thank you, the three of you, for being on this project and for joining me to present our preliminary results. So without further ado, I will begin with the first presentation here. So we've called this talk Rediscovering the Dead of Roman York because, in a sense, we are rediscovering them and reimagining them. And that fits with the overall theme of the York Festival of Ideas theme this year, which is rediscovering, reimagining, reuniting, and so on. So I'd like to talk a bit about Roman burial, death and burial in general, and then lead up to the topic of today and what we've actually been examining in the Yorkshire Museum collections. I will just say that obviously I think the clue is in the title of this talk. There are images of death and burial and human remains. So it was in the program, but if anyone didn't know that or feels that they'd rather not see any of that, now's the time to leave. I think we've tried to be very discreet, but there are some images nevertheless. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy Creighton, who's going to introduce York Museums Trust and the collections that we've been working on. Sorry, Lucy. Lucy Creighton.
Thank you, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. So as Maureen has, thank you for a wonderful introduction. I'm Lucy, I'm Curator of Archaeology here at York Museums Trust, and what I'm going to do in my brief 10 minutes is introduce you to the Yorkshire Museum and the Roman collections specifically, focusing on a little bit of history of kind of collecting practice, some of the key themes within that collection, and focusing a little bit on kind of the historic provenance or lack of provenance for some of our early collections and the kind of challenges and opportunities it provides for both us curators and researchers. So welcome to the Yorkshire Museum. It's fantastic to see so many of you. I'll echo Maureen's thoughts. Hopefully many of you have been here before and know a little bit about our history. We hold the natural and archaeological collections for Yorkshire with a focus on York and North Yorkshire. We have absolutely vast collections in archaeology, numismatics, geology and biology, and all of those are designated as of national importance. You're sat in the Yorkshire Museum today, and the roots of the museum began with the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, who formed in York in 1822. And opened this building here in 1830 after quickly outgrowing their first museum, which was on Ousegate. And the Yorkshire Philosophical Society began collecting antiquities and other collections to start to understand and figure out our human and natural past. And really, the collecting of the antiquities of York began. And on this slide here, you can see that on the left we have a rather lovely 19th century engraving of the Yorkshire Museum that's in the York Art Gallery collection. And then on the right, if you were to visit the Yorkshire Museum in 1881, you could pay 1 shilling to get this rather lovely handbook that would tell you lots of detail about all of the collections that you were seeing. So, let's start with our first Roman object to be acquired by the Yorkshire Museum. This is the fantastic head of Constantine, made of Italian marble. It's part of a twice life-sized sculpture of the Emperor Constantine that was erected here in York, probably near the Principia, so the headquarters of the Roman fortress, most likely made to celebrate the proclamation of Constantine as emperor, an international event that happened in AD 306 right here in York. This is one of our star objects. You can see it in our galleries. It was found in the early 19th century, and the level of contextual information and provenance is as you may expect. It was donated by YPS founding member James Atkinson with the following information: found before 1823, near Stonegate, whilst someone was digging a drain. So it kind of shows that even for our star objects, we can interpret them so far, but there's so much that we don't know about the context and the provenance of this material. So this is object number 1, acquired all the way back in the early days of the YPS Museum. But as you can expect, collecting has continued. The Roman collection is nearly 200 years in the making, and it has grown hugely in quantity, significance, and diversity. The roots of collecting have changed drastically from the early days, and much of our material now comes in through 2 routes that these kind of beautiful objects symbolise. On the left we have the Rydale hoard, a wonderful Roman hoard buried in the late 2nd century, found by metal detectorists in a field near Ampleforth. I'm not going to dwell on this hoard. I would encourage you to go and see our temporary exhibition next door, which looks at it in a lot of detail. Much of our collection now comes from metal detectorists, the new objects that we acquire. And then on the right, this tiny intaglio, blown up to massive scale, but in reality just a centimetre high, represents the many thousands of archaeological archives from community, commercial and research excavations that we hold and continue to collect. So the Yorkshire Museum's Roman collection now numbers about 30,000 coins and small finds and 4,000 boxes of bulk archaeological material from many hundreds of sites. And as you can imagine, that gives great geographical diversity. We collect from York and across much of North Yorkshire, and great thematic diversity as well. We have material from important urban military and civilian centres like Eberacum itself, but we also have military sites from across North Yorkshire, rural settlements, and of course stray finds like the Rydale hoard. And together these build up a really vivid picture of life in Roman Yorkshire. But returning to those early collections, like Constantine, the heart of the collection and its core still resides with these early finds from York. Those finds whose acquisition and discovery date from the 19th and early 20th century. So it's those finds that I'm going to focus on in this talk. And the context of all of this is because the wonderful gypsum burials that Maureen and my colleagues will be speaking about later, much of that material falls into this category of early finds, early collections. Now, much of these early finds were found during the building boom of the 19th and early 20th century, when building works outside of the outlines of the medieval and the Roman city caused disturbance of previously unexplored areas. those mostly lying outside the Roman city often were Roman cemetery areas, with cemeteries developing outside of the bounds of the urban settlement and along the main roads that linked Eboracum with other nearby Roman settlements. And big projects such as the building of the railway station, the railway infrastructure, the York to Scarborough cutting, and also the suburban housing developments in the southwest and the north of the city, all explored these amazing cemetery sites and found thousands of archaeological objects. I'm going to focus on a few of those to kind of look at the different types of evidence that we have in our collection. And this is exploring one of the strong themes of the collection, which is funerary archaeology, the archaeology of the dead of Roman York and Yorkshire. So as I said, York Railway Station, well, when it opened in 1877, it was the largest railway station in the world. And the building of that uncovered the largest area of York's Roman cemeteries that have been investigated. Many thousands of finds were discovered, including lots of grave goods, so objects that were buried with the dead. And you can see a few examples here. On the left, we have an amazing lead cremation urn. So this urn held the cremated remains of the dead, inscribed with the name of the person, presumably whose remains lay within it. We have a gold mouth plaque, which was placed over the face of one of the deceased people. And I'll draw your attention to this amazing hairpiece with jet hairpins that is an amazing survival and was found in a burial that included gypsum, which is our particular interest today. The railway station excavations uncovered around 40 sarcophagi, including the sarcophagi of Julia Fortunata, who you may have seen in the museum itself. Many of those sarcophagi included interior lead and wood coffins and also gypsum burials. We have, as well as grave goods, an amazing collection of funerary sculpture and tombstones. I love this photo on the left. This is the tombstone of Julia Velva, which was found in 1922 during that suburban expansion that I mentioned. And you can see the workmen here very proud of their find before hoiking it out of the ground, no doubt. It's on display just on the other side of that wall, so do go and have a look. And this is a fantastic 3rd century scene of a high status family with Julia the deceased reclining in the middle there. And then, of course, we have the human remains themselves, the remains of the dead. And perhaps the most well-known and famous of those Roman individuals is the lady known as the Ivory Bangle Lady, who is depicted here in this rather vibrant street scene, this market scene, just behind the fish, interestingly. The Ivory Bangle Lady is a fantastic individual, a high-status woman buried towards the end of the Roman occupation in Britain. She's a fantastic case study for how new archaeological research and the application of new scientific techniques can absolutely transform our understanding and our interpretations of individuals. Her name comes from the beautiful elephant ivory bangles from Africa that she wears on her wrists. And she's also, her grave was full of other high-status grave goods. She was clearly an important and a wealthy lady. One of the grave goods in her grave is a small bone inscription. It likely adorned a box or something like that with Christian words on it, possible Christian words on it. And this led to her interpretation for over 100 years in the Yorkshire Museum as simply a high-status Christian lady of York. She was found in 1901, I should say. However, research by the University of Reading as part of their diaspora project, osteological and isotopic analyses were undertaken on the bones of Ivory Bangle Lady, and they shed so much light onto her life. They suggested that she had mixed racial ancestry and that she was a migrant to York. She wasn't born here. She was born somewhere where the climate was much warmer and somewhere on the coast, so perhaps even North Africa. These new insights into this historic individual in our collection absolutely transform our understanding of Roman York and the diversity of the population here. Ivory Bangle Lady is now a case study in schools for the diversity of Roman Britain, which is such an important story for us to be telling. So Ivory Bangle Lady is a fantastic example, I think, of how the application of new techniques can transform our historic collections. So I want to talk very briefly, and I'm finishing up now, don't you worry, just about how we as museums do and can engage audiences with these amazing collections. This lovely image here is of our old Roman Museum of Antiquities, which was housed in the Hospitium in Museum Gardens. It's rather striking and maybe a little bit of a scary place to enter, and you can see that objects have been grouped by type and carefully arranged in these display cases, and that large mosaic in the centre of the room has been diligently cordoned off lest anybody try to touch it. All very nice to look at, but as we can, I think, all agree, not very engaging for audiences. And of course, museums have come on leaps and bounds now, and our galleries focus on visitor experience, telling the stories of people and creating interactive experiences. But what's the next step? How will museums in the future interpret and engage audiences who maybe have new and more modern expectations around technology and experience? On the board here are a few examples of the fun things that we've done in recent years at the Yorkshire Museum to try and engage that 21st century audience. But I'm really excited that colleagues from Heritage 360 are here today, because I think the opportunities through projects like 3D scanning of collections, these 3D prints here being the kind of outcome of that, are really quite transformational in terms of their potential for museum engagement. So I'm going to leave my presentation there. We'll hopefully be able to pick up many of these topics in our discussion later, but without further ado, I'll hand over to Maureen Carroll. Thank you.
Okay, part two. I'm going to talk a bit about Roman burials now and about burial customs in the context of the Roman Empire in general. I'll be showing examples from Italy primarily, but also examples from the western provinces, of which Britain was one. The primary way, and what in antiquity, at least until the middle of the 2nd century AD, was thought as the Roman way of disposing of the dead, was to cremate human remains. That is, to bury the body on a pyre until it was reduced to ash and small bits of calcined bone. And cremation burials we have from all over the empire, including from York. The body is burned, personal objects, food, etc. were burned with them on the pyre and then collected and deposited in an urn. And I just show you here a few of the different types of cremation urns that existed, made of glass, made of lead, pottery, stone, and marble. And also in Rome, in underground cemeteries like the one at the right, where cremation urns were placed in the niches of a building, able to accommodate thousands of people that way. So until about the middle of the 2nd century AD, in Italy at least, this was the way that people disposed of the dead. Cremation became common in the western provinces from the 1st century AD. Now, cremation is something that required highly specialized knowledge. It was a way to display wealth, and you really wanted to make sure that the pyre was built correctly and that the body would be consumed correctly. What you didn't want is a case of the body not being consumed properly or it falling half-burnt off a pyre. And we have reports from antiquity about that. So you need a specialist to build the pyre, to know how high the temperature must be, how the wood and other substances on the pyre are going to burn. It was also quite theatrical, as you can imagine. There are the scents, the sounds of a burial, and the sight of the flames consuming a body. So So it's a prime way of displaying wealth, especially if someone who was to be cremated was carried to the cemetery in a procession on an ivory bed, for which we have evidence. And also burned with incense and perfumes. We're thinking of the smells that would be released, making it a sensory perception and a sensory memory. It was certainly more costly than a normal burial and more theatrical. Roman inhumation burials, by inhumation I mean simply buried in a container or buried in a pit in the ground, became common in Italy from the middle of the 2nd century AD. They don't catch on in the western provinces as the primary way to dispose of the dead until well into the 3rd century, including in York. The containers used to dispose of the bodies ranged from simple shrouds and brick structures, and even reused wine amphorae, which you can see here, to stone, marble, and lead coffins. And if you go for a stroll through the museum gardens, and you see these displayed in the lovely museum gardens in amongst the tulips, etc. These are Roman stone sarcophagi or coffins that were found in York that have been used in part to landscape the museum gardens. Personal objects were buried inside the coffin with the dead, or sometimes outside the coffin within the grave pit. Status now, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, was expressed in the material of the coffin. A marble coffin that was highly ornate and that might have the depiction of the deceased carved on the lid was a way of expressing status. Also, the clothing that was displayed on the dead while they were being carried to the cemetery and while they were being laid in the coffin showed wealth. And also, of course, the personal adornment of the dead. And a lot of personal adornment was buried with the dead. Grave goods range from items that were used in life by the deceased, such as things like spindle whorls, tools that the deceased used when they were alive, to offerings of toys and terracotta figurines. You can see some examples on the lower right here, primarily for children. Food for the afterlife, whole cuts of meat, jugs of wine were placed into the grave. Jewelry, you can see a very lovely example on the lower left-hand side. Clothing and expensive textiles, of which you see an example here in the middle on the left, of purple-dyed textile, wool textile, shot through with gold threads. Very expensive. So this is how the status of the deceased could be expressed. And we also have in family mausolea sometimes tomb paintings such as this one that show the deceased in all of their finery and their Sunday best clothing. Since today we are dealing with a particular ritual of burial that involves textiles, let's just briefly review what we know about their use in Roman funerary contexts. When the dead lay in state in their homes for a short period of time, they were either dressed in their best clothing, as this woman here at the top reclining in a relief from Rome, or they were dressed and shrouded, and you can see an example on the upper right of a child who has a shroud placed over him. And on the lower right we can also see on this tomb painting from Rome two individuals here who are shrouded outside the tomb in which they will be interred. They're ready for burial, so to speak. But note that in all these cases the faces are exposed, so that the relatives, even at the very last minute, could engage with them before they disappeared from sight. Some images in Roman art indicate, however, that the body, when deposited in the coffin or the tomb, was wrapped or shrouded from head to toe with the face covered. The procedure looks much like it does now for natural burials, an example of which I show you at the bottom, an example of a shroud burial. So the deceased at this point disappeared from view and from interaction with the living. This was the final step in the procedure and the process of death and burial. But something else could be added to the body which has puzzled and still puzzles archaeologists, namely the use of plaster, gypsum, or chalk in inhumation burials. Examples of these appear in North Africa in the 2nd century AD and in Italy at the same time, and later in the northern provinces of Germany and Britain. But the materials were used in very different ways. For example, this burial on the lower right, you can see a white layer underneath the skeleton. This is chalk. Gypsum is a mineral that's mined and mixed with water can make almost a plaster-like substance. This is just chalk dust spread on the bottom of the coffin under the body. As I say, we don't always know the reasons for this. A plaster burial here on the left in Germany, in Trier, where the dead was clearly laid on a bed of soft gypsum or plaster, leaving an impression. Examples from the upper left from Rome, possibly the result of an epidemic where we have several hundred bodies buried on top of each other, clothed, wrapped in shrouds, and then drenched in plaster so they remain tightly bound. And we have at the top from North Africa also a soft bedding of gypsum or plaster into which the body was laid. So the body is laid into these particular types of gypsum or plaster burials. In Britain, the largest concentration of burials in which gypsum was used is in fact Roman York. Here we see the custom of pouring liquid gypsum from a bucket or a container, we don't know how it worked, over the bodies of adults and children laid to rest in stone or lead coffins before their deposition in the ground. As the gypsum hardened around the bodies and they then broke down, a negative cavity formed that preserved the original position and contours of the dead. And I'm showing you a couple examples here from 2007, Mill Mount in York. I live off the mount, and it's quite nice to have some of my neighbors here. Yes, we live on top of Roman cemeteries. So these are local, and these Mill Mount, this was a 2007 excavation, and you can see the coffin opened, the layer of gypsum. When the gypsum is starting to be removed, you can see the individual underneath, roughly a 14-year-old boy. And the analysis of this was done by my colleague at the University of York, Malin Holst. We have another example at the lower left, which we have yet to investigate, in the storerooms of the Yorkshire Museum, where you can see this void where the body has decomposed, and you can see the skeleton and the gypsum wrapped around it. And a lovely example, courtesy of the Danham Gallery, Library and Museum, the curator of whom is here today. Luckily, this is a burial found in Pollington, north of Doncaster, and you can see how the void in the gypsum burial is preserved, and when the gypsum is broken away, you can see the skeleton inside. So this is the York or Yorkshire way, I would say, of using gypsum. It seems to be something quite special and different. The concentration in York, I've mapped about 50 of these gypsum burials in York thus far, recorded since the late 19th century. And here you can see the railway has the biggest dot of them all. That was late 19th century, not carefully excavated, but at least notes were made of these burials. They all seem to be of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. 16 of these gypsum casings survive in the Yorkshire Museum, and the team here today have been studying these in the last months. The imprint of shrouds, clothing, and footwear also survives in the gypsum, providing precious evidence for perishable materials that rarely survive in graves. If they do survive, textiles, for example, they might survive in minute fragments, which can be analyzed by specialists to reconstruct the presentation of the dead, as in the reconstruction on the upper right from Augst in Switzerland, dating to the 4th century AD. Otherwise, clothing and textiles are lost. It is not clear why and for whom this gypsum ritual was chosen here in York or Yorkshire, but it appears to have been a custom associated with individuals of high status. There's no indication that this is rushed or hurried or a response to an epidemic. These people are buried in all of their finery, and more recent investigations of the gypsum casings have shown that the bodies were drenched or wrapped in material that had exotic resins in it, such as frankincense from as far away as Arabia, which obviously only the elite could afford. So these are wealthy people who are given this particular treatment. And you can see on the lower left how well the imprint, even the weave of textiles, is preserved in the gypsum burials. So without the textiles being there, we can still know what textiles were in the graves. A major component of the current project is the transformation of these negatives in the gypsum casings into positive images through digital technology, and this will be part 3 of our presentation. And may I add, this is the first time ever in the Roman world that this technology has been applied to this type of burial. And the gypsum burials from York are ideal for this because the body was encased in liquid gypsum and it preserves it. My colleagues at Heritage 360 have produced a stunning 3D model of this gypsum burial of a family with 2 adults and an infant who died at the same time and were deposited together in the coffin. Now, with the naked eye, it might be a bit difficult to see the 2 adults. You'll see how clear they are on the 3D images, but I think you can easily recognize the infant here. The impression of one of the adults is here and the other one here. Now, this is unusual. Most of the, I think all of the gypsum casings that we have in the Yorkshire Museum are singular burials, but this one has a family, I think, a family of 3. So perhaps this is a family who fell ill and all died at the same time, because they are all buried at the same time. In preparation for the burial of this group of bodies, they were completely wrapped from head to toe in shrouds and textiles, with the faces covered. The casing and its 3D scan, which Pat and James will now present, allow us to witness a poignant family tragedy not witnessed for almost 2,000 years after it occurred, reminding us of the fragility of life in antiquity and also the care invested in the burial of at least a select group of people in York. And I have to say, when you see the 3D images, keep in mind that you are the first people, or we are when we did the 3D scanning, to see this particular scene since the lid closed on that coffin. And that is something that's absolutely exciting. So we hope in future to explore all of York's gypsum burials, as well as others in Britain, such as the one I mentioned from Doncaster and another one from Castleford in the Wakefield Museum, and we're still searching for others in Yorkshire. And we're doing that to try to ascertain who these people were and what cultural or practical reason there might have been that dictated this ritual. And also to use digital technology to produce complete and absolutely cutting-edge visual reconstructions of the burials. And I'm sure this technology will have a great impact on museum collections around the world. So thank you for that, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Pat and James from Heritage 360 to show you the gypsum burials, the scans.
So I'm just going to follow on from where Maureen left off and show you the scan of the gypsum cast that we took relatively recently, a couple of months ago. Now, in this impression, you can see that we are looking at the negatives of these 3 individuals. But essentially what we've been able to do is, with the scanned data, is turn that data as almost upside down. And what we then get is this positive image of the individuals within there. Now, this is quite useful because obviously now these individuals become a lot clearer. We can see them a lot better. But also, the negative impression that we saw previously, that is actually a mirror image of how those bodies, those individuals were arranged within that burial position. Now what we see is those bodies in that actual sort of position that they would have been buried in. So we have flipped that mirror and we are now looking at those individuals. So again, we can now see that they are quite clear. Obviously, one down on this left-hand side, a slightly larger individual on the right-hand side, and then we do have the infant down here. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, just to show you the detail that we can start capturing with the scanning technology here. So we can see a lot of the wrappings in there, and I'll go into this a little bit later, but also there are a number of other areas that are of significant interest. One thing that we can also do with the scan technology is that at the moment we're looking at the surface detail but also a photographic texture on top there. We can, if we want, turn that off, and then you can see the details become even clearer, because essentially we've removed that layer of contrast and all we're looking at now is the surface details. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the 3D scanning technology, why it's important, how we use it, and then how we've applied it to this particular project. Okay. So first of all, I'd start off with what is 3D scanning? Well, really, this is a technology that gives us the ability to digitally capture the form and appearance of a surface. Different forms of 3D scanning exist. This allows us to capture tiny objects such as the Roman intaglio that you can see up in the top right corner there, right the way through to entire buildings. And this is my colleague James scanning the medieval gatehouse in St Mary's Abbey just outside. With drone technology and aircraft and even satellites, we can scan entire landscapes, and this has been very useful for looking at archaeological landscape data. Some forms of scanning use lasers, but the scanners that we were using on this project use a technique known as structured light. Now this projects pulses of light onto a surface and then measures how that light is reflected and refracted and deformed. So it's looking at kind of contrast and shadow within there. Now our scanners are highly accurate, and as you saw from that scan previously, we're measuring surface details at an average of 0.1 to 0.2 millimetre. Sometimes, depending on the lighting conditions, we can even get finer detail than that. So these are very, very useful bits of technology to really start analysing these surfaces. So why do we use 3D scanning? Well, there's a number of different reasons, and within the project that we've been doing on the gypsum casts, it kind of brings all of these together. The first is conservation and preservation. When we scan something, we capture its shape and its texture and its colour in a digital form. This information can then be used to supplement museum archives, giving curators and researchers much better, more detailed information when investigating and caring for collections. Another really important use of 3D scanning is to inform repairs. If an object or a structure is ever damaged or becomes worn. A really good example of this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which, as most of you know, was significantly damaged by fire a number of years ago. Fortunately, just before that fire occurred, there was a laser scan taken of the interior of that building, and that has really helped the reconstruction efforts. Similarly, in Palmyra, we can see that this is an ancient city in Syria which was heavily damaged by Islamic State militants. Unfortunately, no 3D scans were taken at this site before that damage occurred. But through other technologies, we have been able to use photographs that people have simply donated of that site, and then a 3D model has been able to be built up from that. So as Lucy was talking about earlier, the public engagement side of 3D scanning is a really useful way of presenting archaeology to the public in an engaging and interactive way. One of the important things is that every angle can be shown. A lot of objects are often too large or too fragile to be able to move around. We were recently talking to a colleague who's been doing some scanning on a very fragile 19th century army coat. Now this is in the Army Museum here in York, and the curators there have never seen the back of it. It's never been moved. Well, it hadn't been moved for about 30 years or so. So being able to move that out, take a 3D scan, put it back carefully, they then have the full 3D of that to be able to analyse that a little closer. Small and important details can also be highlighted within 3D scans. And we've been talking about those really sort of fine details of the weave within the gypsum casts, and that's one area that we've really been focusing on with our sort of high-resolution scanning. Colours and texture can be turned off, as I showed you before, to show an object's surface only, and that can really help bring out fine details which are often not visible to the naked eye. A good example of this is some scanning that we've been doing recently on this prison door. Now this is from Northallerton, And this prison door is a 19th century door, but was in use for over 100 years. And you can just about make out up there, there's quite a lot of graffiti, which has been etched in on there. Now, from the photographic scan, we can just about make that out, but take away that thing and we can really start seeing those layers of graffiti which have been built up over decades start to come out. Once we get in closer there, we can start sort of separating those. 3D prints can also be created from the 3D scans that we take. And a great example of this is the Rydale Hoard scans which we took, which was then turned into these wonderful, really realistic 3D prints that you can see on the bottom right there. Now this is possible from any form of 3D scan. Obviously creating the colour and the texture on top of there requires a lot of expertise, and we were lucky enough to work with a company called ThinkC3D who specialise in this kind of thing. But this means that visitors can touch and handle objects which they would never ever be able to touch and handle with the originals. So there's a lot of kind of interactive and engagement potential for 3D scanning. Obviously scans can't replace those original objects, but they can offer support, they can offer fascinating additional information. Now the last thing is obviously research. This is why we do 3D scanning in a lot of the cases, and certainly in the case of the gypsum cast project we've been looking at the moment. The fine detail provided by 3D scanning allows us to take micro measurements on an object's surface of just fractions of a millimetre, and this can be really helpful when analysing. Especially, it supports archaeological research, especially in the sciences, where small differences in the form of a bone or the markings or etchings on a rock, these can really help inform different interpretations of use or purpose. We can even involve 3D scanning at the very point of archaeological discovery, and that's on-site at excavations. And you can see in the bottom right here, this is a 3D scan that we took on-site on Micklegate fairly recently with York Archaeology. And it's one of our hopes that scanning can be involved at the start of an archaeological excavation, throughout, and at the end, to really help with the recording and maximise the efficiency of the archaeologists on site. I should say that scans can actually be taken very, very quickly, and we will have a demonstration of this a little bit later. But in previous technologies, we often use photographs to create 3D renderings of objects, a technique called photogrammetry. But that's quite labour-intensive, it takes a long time. Often to create a good model, we need 30, 40, 50, sometimes even 100 photographs. And obviously taking those takes a long time. If we're using our 3D scanners, we can capture an object in 2 to 3 minutes. So obviously that makes a huge difference in terms of the efficiency of how we can go about recording archaeological information. So looking at the gypsum casts, this project actually covers elements of all of those reasons of doing 3D scanning before. We're looking at preservation, we're also looking at public engagement, but more importantly, we're looking at that research aspect as well. The initial scan of the cast on display in the Yorkshire Museum was actually taken through the glass case. We were actually scanning the Four Seasons mosaic, and on the way back to the office, the curators that we were working with said, well, do you want to have a go at this gypsum cast? And we thought, well, it's through glass, but we can have a go. Fortunately, that scan turned out absolutely wonderful. The resolution was great, but obviously it was missing a few things. We wanted to go back and scan that. But let's just jump back and have a look at the scan itself, because what we were able to see within that was obviously the quality and positioning of the wrappings. Hopefully we will be able to see the weave as well in there, and that's going to really help with fabric analysis and maybe even provencing those fabrics. If I go in closer to one of the upper head areas, we can also start seeing string ties, which were used to bind the wrappings and seal them off. Importantly, the scans can help us examine the positioning of these. And as Maureen says, this is quite a unique situation in that there are 3 individuals buried in this particular inhumation. So looking at how those individuals are arranged, whether they are on their sides, how they are kind of sort of interfacing together, how they're sort of positioned, is going to be really helpful from this scan. We can also start looking at what might be inside these wrappings. Now, one of the things that popped out to us fairly early on was this kind of strange linear thing coming out here. Now, it's unlikely this is part of the infant individual there. It's quite possible that this is something that was inhumed with that individual, which is encased within the wrappings there. So just to wrap up, we've looked at a number of different things. Obviously, there's a lot of analysis still to go, and my colleagues here will be perhaps speaking a little bit about that in the Q&A that we're going to have. But we really hope that these scans are, without any pun intended, going to shed additional light on this intriguing burial practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for the input into this project and for your presentations today. I hope you find this, I think it was very gratifying to hear that sort of intake of breath when you saw the 3D image, because that's exactly how I felt when I saw it the first time. So I think we've got some time for questions for any or all of us, if anybody has any. Now would be the time. Yes.
I'm assuming you didn't find the skeletons and what was in the sarcophagus of that family. So literally all there was gypsum, and so the skeleton and everything that's in there gone. Is that correct?
That's a great question. One of the things I highlighted in my talk is the early nature of these finds, and as you can imagine, diligent records were not always kept, and human remains were not always retained. So we, at this moment in time, don't have the associated human remains and grave goods or coffin from this burial. So the gypsum cast is all we have. We're currently, thanks to funding from the University of York, doing a bit of a scoping study with our own collections to see how much the historic sources may allow us to piece together those burials, which of course have multiple elements that have become disparate. So there is potential to do that physically and bring the collection together in some cases. But at this moment in time, yes, the gypsum is all we have, so it preserves just fantastic evidence for human remains and grave goods that were potentially not retained. And I think that's what's so exciting for this technology for me. I think, Maureen, you were even looking at the measurements of the infant. We may be able to infer the age of that individual. You can look at the height of the adults as well. There really is so much information that you can gain from this cast that I never dreamt would be possible.
Yes.
Has any analysis been done whether it might be an normal toss uses for shrouds, or was it normally one thing or another?
Well, we will be able to do that. We're planning on applying for money for a bigger project, and that will include a textile specialist and someone who's worked with the plaster casts of the victims of Pompeii. I don't know how many of you have seen those. I think they're quite iconic, and what nobody has done with them thus far, although they're plaster casts from the late 19th, early 20th century, no one has actually looked at the textile imprints of the clothing these people were buried in were wearing when they died. And so that is a potential expert we'll have in the project. And based on the weaves that are visible on the imprints, this person will be able to tell us whether it's linen or wool, whether it's fine or coarse, and so on. So we'll know better. Because it would be an interesting question. Are they just using any old bit of fabric that they can find? Or are they, which I suspect, using something that's quite high quality to keep with the high status of the whole ritual? Yeah.
I missed why there was the gypsum poured on them, and was it part of the ceremony of the burial itself, when people were present at the burial, and then there was somebody pouring gypsum over them?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think my sense at the moment is that yes, it would be something when the coffin is lowered into the grave pit with the lid still off, and people are looking at it for the last time, that's the place the gypsum would be poured over it. If for no other reason also than to just reduce the procedure of having to carry things, and I think the coffin might already be in the pit, the bodies come in, the coffin could be there, transported a few days ahead of time or whatever, then the bodies come in and then the gypsum is poured on top in the cemetery. I think that's most likely. The reason why it was done, this is the point of our project as well, to try and find a reason, a practical reason, a cultural reason, a religious reason, why this ritual might have been applied. I would really like to have that light bulb moment one morning waking up and saying, I know why, but I haven't had it yet, and I may never. But it's interesting to consider all of the options. Yes?
When you showed the positioning of the burials that you found dotted around, have you related those to structures or anything that might indicate why they were in those positions?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of them around what became the railroad site. That seemed to have been a very densely occupied Roman cemetery from the 2nd century into the 4th century AD. Most of the stone coffins that we know from York came from that excavation when the railway station was built. So it's a very large cemetery, and there are some very wealthy burials there. The ones that I showed you south of York, off Blossom Street, the Mount and Abermall Road, Mill Mount and so on, that is a cemetery that has, as far as we can tell thus far, the greatest number of very large elaborate tombstones. So I think that is a cemetery that was of some high status for individuals. That might explain why there's a concentration of them in both those places. But they're both outside the Roman city walls. They're both accepted cemeteries. We have a couple burials out in Heslington and Fulford. Those don't really have too much to do with the town of York. Those are probably burials of a family burial ground outside a Roman villa on the outskirts. So I think we can piece together generally what the context might originally have been. Yeah. Pardon? Put. It's in Tunisia. It's modern day Spetla. I'll come to Tunisia.
The implication that you give is that gypsum was particular to Yorkshire. Is that true, or did I misinterpret that?
No, you didn't misinterpret this. This is research that's ongoing, and there are two places in particular where we have a large number of so-called gypsum burials in Britain, which I've been exploring to try and figure out the size of a potential project in future. And we basically are interested in the custom of liquid gypsum being poured over the body as it's executed here in York. Those two places are down in Dorset, outside Dorchester, at Poundbury, a very large Roman cemetery, and the other are the cemeteries of Roman London. And they're referred to in the literature as gypsum burial, but upon closer examination, it turns out that these are burials that make use of chalk dust underneath the body. So it is not the custom of pouring gypsum. So at the moment, there are a couple gypsum burials, so called, in Kent, and one in Colchester that I know of, and we'll be looking at those to see if those two are something different. If they are something different, then it looks like the York and Yorkshire custom of using gypsum is quite unique.
So what happened elsewhere?
Well, plaster or gypsum burials are not common anywhere. I mean, I would say this is maybe 0.1% of the burials in Roman York, and even less so in London or in Poundbury or in North Africa for that matter. Normally, the body is buried in a sarcophagus at this period in time, wrapped or clothed with grave goods and so on. The lid is put on and that's it. So this idea of preserving the body, is that what's going on? We don't know. This particular ritual is a very puzzling one, and one that's going to keep us busy for a while trying to find an answer to. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. I think you were first.
You mentioned about a change of practice from cremation to burial.
Yes.
Second century.
Uh-huh.
Is that religious practices driving that, or is it some other cultural?
Well, that's a very good question too, and that's another one archaeologists don't have an answer to. One of the first emperors, for example, to be buried rather than cremated was the Emperor Hadrian in the 130s AD. And that was at odds with every other emperor who'd ever been buried before, who had always been cremated. We know that in the Roman period in Greece, before the Romans were there, and throughout the Roman period in Greece, bodies were never burnt. They were always inhumed, and Hadrian was a very Philhellenic emperor who spent an awful lot of time there. And it could be that for some reason he adopted that particular burial custom, and then it caught on with the elite, because you want to do what the emperor's doing, and it catches on with the elite and then trickles down to other levels of society. At the moment, that's the best explanation we have. There was one back there. Yeah.
Where do you think it's possible that by pouring gypsum over the bodies, it would prevent people from grave robbing? You could see if the grave had been interfered with straight away.
And yet it didn't. It didn't, because we have a couple of them. Castle Yard, 2 examples of gypsum burials, I think, where the sarcophagus has clearly been reused and the original inhabitant has been booted out. Yeah. As you can see, there's a long list of potential reasons why they did it. Did it have something to do with hygiene? Was it status? Was it religious? Was it to prevent grave robbers? Those are all potential answers, which we hope to get closer to. I think there was one question.
I was just going to say,
Oh, okay.
I think it could be something to do with possibly the keys, I don't know, helping to prevent spread of disease, keep whatever there within,
Yeah. No, it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle I like.
Was gypsum expensive?
We don't know if gypsum was expensive, and we don't know where this came from. So part of the future project will be to have a materials expert who will analyze the gypsum and give us the recipe for the gypsum. What's in it, ratio of water to gypsum, etc., and where that gypsum might have come from. I've been told that in Derbyshire there's gypsum reserves, so it might come from there. I think this will be the last question. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the burial at the railway station with the hair and the pins.
Yeah.
Was that live hair, as it were, or was it a wig?
That's live hair.
It was live hair.
Yeah.
It's definitely human hair. As far as I'm aware, it's never been closely scrutinised, and something that I would love to be able to do is to do some ADNA or isotopic analysis on the hair. It could be, again, early records, scant information. Could be attached hair, or it could be a hair piece that a wealthy lady has purchased to wear. So
It apparently was found under the skull.
Yeah.
I assumed it was real hair, but I wanted to know whether it was actually a wig, they buried in your wig.
Yeah. Okay. well that gives you an idea also of what gypsum can preserve. It can preserve textiles, it can preserve hair, which otherwise we wouldn't have normally. So did you, James, do you want to say something about the scanning?
Yeah, the live scanning.
Yeah, so I think that's all the time we have for questions, but if anyone would like to stay just for a couple of minutes and see a demonstration of scanning using a couple pieces of gypsum casings that Lucy has kindly provided for today, you're welcome to do that. So I'll hand over to James, and thank you all for your attention.
Even though we have this wonderful huge screen, unfortunately the scanner doesn't speak directly to it, so the results are going to be on this small laptop here. So we'll ask you to kind of come down in small groups and have a little look if you are interested. As Pat explained, the technology for the scanning involves pulsing light, which is quite bright. So just to be aware that if you have any sensitivities to that, probably be a good idea to leave the space. Thank you.
What James is going to do is use this scanner here, which is one of the smaller scanners that we have. This is really good for picking up small objects. We can scan anything up to around 4 or 5 metres or so. But when we get into these sort of smaller objects, we do need something which is going to be a bit more high-powered and a bit more focused. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this laptop around a little bit just so you can see how the scan is beginning to build up. You can see here the data coming in on the left-hand side.
So there's going to be a certain line where you've scanned to.
Yeah, that's right.
And it recognises that.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's very good at not creating a seam between it because the data is so accurate.
Yeah.
So it will be effectively flawless where it stitches those different parts back together.
So what we would usually do with an object like this is 2 scans. We'd scan the top surface, then we would turn that upside down and scan the bottom surface. Now, because the geometry of that object is captured around the sides, theoretically the scanner will be able to know where it is when we turn it upside down. It will recognise the bits that it's already scanned and say, this is another side of it. So as you can see on the screen there, we have 2 sides of that object, and what James is going to try and do is now then align them into one single object. So alongside the actual capture of the scan, we do have a small piece of processing that we need to do afterwards to make that a single object.
Where it should be, and you can do this and it works. Everything fast. There we go, so that has aligned itself. And what I will do is I'll start to quickly process this with the data here. While it doesn't capture the anything inside, it's not scanning, it purely is light scanning, so from the exterior. On a good day it does actually capture, I think, 0.05 of a millimetre, so it's absolute micro.